3 weeks after what neighbors now called the Buddy incident, Karen stood in her front yard, staring at the FORSAA sign her realtor had just hammered into the ground. The lawsuit was moving forward. The HOA insurance wouldn't cover her personal liability. The emergency board election had unanimously removed her as president. It's a seller's market, her realtor said cheerfully. Even with, well, everything going on. Karen nodded absently, noting with professional detachment that her own lawn had developed brown patches. She hadn't had the energy to maintain her usual standards. Mrs. Whitfield? Karen turned to find Walter standing awkwardly at the edge of her driveway. The board wanted me to deliver this, he said, extending an envelope. Inside was a formal censure, along with a breakdown of legal expenses the HOA would not be covering on her behalf. Karen scanned the document with practiced efficiency, her face betraying nothing until she reached the final paragraph. A public apology, she read aloud, to be delivered at the community center. Walter shuffled uncomfortably. It was the only compromise we could reach with the Millers that might produce damages. Absolutely not, Karen snapped, her old fire flaring briefly. That's tantamount to admitting full culpability. Karen, Walter said, uncharacteristically direct, you authorized hunters on private property to retaliate against a homeowner. A child's therapy dog died. What exactly are you not culpable for? The question hung in the air between them. Karen had spent years cultivating invulnerability through rules and regulations. Now that armor was gone, leaving her exposed. Everyone makes mistakes, she said finally. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. Walter's voice was gentle but firm. You chose to use your position to punish someone, and it had consequences you never considered. Karen turned away, unwilling to let him see the emotion rising to her face. I'll consider the board's request. After Walter left, Karen sat on her pristine front porch, watching the neighborhood she'd ruled like a personal fiefdom. Joggers who would normally wave now averted their eyes. A woman walking her poodle crossed to the other side of the street when she saw Karen. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter in Chicago. Mom, what the hell? Emma Miller's GoFundMe for a new service dog is all over my social feeds. There are news articles. What were you thinking? What had she been thinking? Karen scrolled back through her mental ledger of offenses. The Millers had been late with dues 3 times, had requested exceptions to the holiday decoration policy due to Emma's medical appointments, had once complained about Karen's inspection frequency. Small rebellions against her authority that she'd catalogued and resented. Had she really authorized hunters to access their land as retaliation? She hadn't framed it that way to herself at the time, but sitting here now, the truth was unavoidable. That evening, Karen found herself driving past the Miller house. She slowed, observing the modest ranch-style home with its wheelchair ramp and specially modified garden beds at raised height. A light was on in what must be Emma's room. Karen parked and sat in her car for nearly 30 minutes, composing and rejecting opening lines in her head. Finally, she drove home without approaching the door. The next day, she listed her house for 20% below market value. Are you sure? Her realtor asked, concerned. I need a quick sale. Karen replied, I can't stay here anymore. The emergency HOA meeting was standing room only. Karen had never seen the community center so packed, not even for the contentious vote on approved fence heights last summer. Every homeowner in Whispering Pines seemed to have materialized, their faces ranging from concerned to openly hostile. Order, please, Karen said, rapping her gavel with significantly less authority than usual. We need to address the unfortunate incident at the Miller property in a calm, rational manner. Unfortunate incident? A man stood up from the third row. Karen recognized him as Dr. Patel from Sycamore Lane. A child service animal was killed because you abused your position. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. I was operating within the guidelines of our covenant, Karen insisted, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. Section 7.3 clearly states that the association maintains certain rights over unimproved portions of. We've all read the covenant, Karen, interrupted Martha from the garden committee. There's nothing in there about authorizing hunting as punishment for late dues. Karen's face flushed. It wasn't punishment. It was utilizing available resources to manage deer overpopulation, which affects all our properties. The room erupted in disbelieving chatter. Karen fought the urge to slam her gavel repeatedly. She'd never lost control of a meeting before. Walter leaned over. Maybe we should talk about compensation for the Millers. That would be admitting liability, Karen hissed back. The hunters failed to verify their location. That's on them. The hunters were told they had permission, Dr. Patel called out. I spoke with them myself. They showed me the email you sent. Karen felt the room's focus intensify. Furthermore, he continued, my wife is an attorney, and she believes that HOA could be held legally responsible for the resulting emotional distress and medical setbacks for Emma Miller. Medical setbacks, Karen repeated. Emma's cerebral palsy management relied heavily on that service dog, Dr. Patel explained, his voice softening. Without Buddy, her mobility and independence are severely compromised. Her physical therapy has been disrupted at a critical development stage. For the first time, the full weight of consequences pressed on Karen's shoulders. This wasn't about unapproved wind chimes or non-regulation mailboxes. This was about a disabled child's well-being. Karen began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. Across the room, Mrs. Miller stood up. The crowd parted as she walked forward, placing a manila folder on the table in front of Karen. This contains Emma's medical history, Buddy's training certification, and the initial filing for our lawsuit against both the HOA and you personally, Karen. Karen stared at the folder. Personally? You acted beyond the scope of your authority, Mrs. Miller said quietly. And my daughter is paying the price. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that. Board members began distancing themselves. Homeowners shouted questions about insurance coverage and legal fees. And through it all, Karen sat frozen, staring at the folder that represented the destruction of her carefully controlled world. Later that night, alone in her immaculately maintained colonial, Karen poured herself a third glass of Chardonnay and opened her laptop. She navigated to the neighborhood social media group she'd so strictly moderated for years. The page had exploded with activity, all of it about her. Karen must resign. Justice for Emma and Buddy. Who put this woman in charge anyway? 11 years of enforcing every minute regulation, of maintaining property values at all costs, reduced to this. As she scrolled through the vitriol, Karen felt something crack inside her impenetrable facade. The community center was filled beyond capacity again, but this time, Karen stood alone at the podium. Her normally perfect appearance had slipped. Her hair lacked its usual precision, her clothing slightly rumpled. 6 weeks of sleepless nights and declining social status had taken their toll. Thank you for coming, she began stiffly, reading from prepared notes. As the former president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, I wish to formally apologize for my actions regarding the authorization of hunters on the Miller property, which resulted in the death of Emma Miller's service animal. The clinical language felt wrong even to her own ears. Karen glanced up, scanning the crowd until she found Emma and her mother in the front row. The girl looked smaller somehow, a wheelchair positioned beside her chair, where previously she had walked with Buddy's assistance. Karen set her notes aside. I've spent my entire adult life enforcing rules, she said, her voice unsteady. I convinced myself it was about maintaining standards and property values. But somewhere along the way, I started to enjoy the power more than the purpose. A murmur rippled through the audience. When Mrs. Miller was late with her dues, I didn't see a single mother struggling to balance medical bills with household expenses. I saw someone defying my authority. Karen's voice cracked. So I retaliated in a way I knew would be perfectly legal according to the covenant's fine print, without ever considering the human cost. Emma was watching her intently now, her young face solemn. I didn't mean for Buddy to get hurt, Karen continued. But that doesn't matter, because I created the situation where it could happen, and Emma is suffering because of my actions. Karen stepped away from the podium, moving to stand directly in front of the Millers. I'm selling my house. The proceeds beyond my mortgage will go to Emma's GoFundMe for a new service dog. She swallowed hard. It won't bring Buddy back or erase what happened, but it might help Emma regain some of what she's lost. The silence in the room was absolute. I'm sorry, Karen said simply. Not because I got caught, or because there's a lawsuit, but because I hurt you, Emma, and you didn't deserve that. Afterward, as people filed out, Karen sat alone on a folding chair, emotionally drained. Dr. Patel's wife, the attorney, approached her. That was unexpected, she said, sitting beside Karen. Was it acceptable? Karen asked. For the legal proceedings. Legally speaking, it helps, the attorney confirmed. But I don't think that's why you did it. Karen considered this. No, she admitted. It wasn't. The house sale, is that real? Karen nodded. I have an offer already. I'm moving to an apartment across town. Starting over? Something like that. As they spoke, Karen watched Emma and her mother leave, the girl now in her wheelchair. The distance between them, physically and metaphorically, seemed insurmountable. What happens now? Karen asked quietly. Now, the attorney said, you figure out who you are when you're not the HOA Karen. That night, alone in her increasingly empty house, Karen found herself searching online for information about cerebral palsy and service dog training. The more she read, the more her chest heightened with the weight of what she'd done. On impulse, she clicked on Emma's GoFundMe page. The comments section was filled with support for the girl and vitriol toward Karen herself. She closed the laptop and, for the first time since the incident, allowed herself to cry. The crack of the rifle shot echoed through the autumn air, followed immediately by a high-pitched yelp that died away too quickly. Karen Whitfield froze mid-sentence during her morning HOA inspection, her clipboard slipping from manicured fingers. For once, the perpetually dissatisfied president of Whispering Pines Homeowners Association was rendered speechless. What on earth? Muttered Walter, her reluctant vice president, squinting toward the tree line that separated their pristine subdivision from the undeveloped woodland beyond. Karen recovered quickly, snapping her clipboard back into position. Probably those hunters I authorized. The Miller's property backs up to the woods. She checked her watch. We're behind schedule. The Jacksons have unapproved wind chimes. Walter's face paled. You authorized hunters. On residential property? Not on residential property, Karen corrected with the condescending tone she'd perfected over 11 years of HOA leadership. Behind it, the Miller's land extends 50 feet into those trees, which is technically still within our jurisdiction. And since Mrs. Miller has been 3 weeks late with her dues, she smiled, a thin stretching of lips that never reached her eyes. I informed the hunting club they could use that access point. Walter opened his mouth to object when Karen's phone rang. She answered with a crisp, Karen Whitfield, HOA president, then listened for precisely 4 seconds before her expression changed. I'm sure it's a misunderstanding, she said, voice brittle. I'll be right there. 20 minutes later, Karen stood on the edge of the Miller's backyard, arms crossed defensively as she faced a sobbing 12-year-old girl. Behind the child, a woman who could only be her mother stood with one hand on her daughter's shoulder and the other cradling a phone displaying animal control's number. His name was Buddy, the girl choked out. He was my therapy dog. He helped me walk. For the first time in recent memory, Karen felt a wave of genuine unease. At the tree line, 2 apologetic hunters in orange vests were speaking with a police officer, gesturing with their hands. Between them, mostly covered by a blue top, lay a medium-sized golden retriever with a special harness still attached. I specifically approved the northeast section, Karen said, her voice unnaturally high. This is the northwest corner. This is my property, Mrs. Miller said coldly. All of it, and you had no right to allow anyone access without my permission. The HOA bylaws clearly state, my daughter has cerebral palsy, Mrs. Miller cut in. Buddy was her service animal. He was specially trained for 3 years. Karen's mouth worked silently. The officer was now walking toward them. Mrs. Whitfield, I need to ask you some questions about authorization of hunting on private property. Karen's mind raced through the relevant HOA bylaws, searching for the clause that would absolve her. There had to be something. There always was. She'd spent years weaponizing the fine print against her neighbors. "This is a terrible accident," she began, reaching for the practiced tone that had diffused countless homeowner complaints. "But if you check Section 7.3 of our covenant..." The words died as the little girl collapsed beside her mother, sobbing unrestrainedly now. Karen felt something unfamiliar twist in her chest, something that felt uncomfortably like guilt. "Unsure we can sort this out," she said weakly, but nobody was listening to her anymore. 6 months later, Karen sat on a bench at Riverside Park, watching families enjoy the spring afternoon. Her life had changed dramatically. The small apartment, a part-time job at the library, no HOA to manage. The lawsuit had settled, her house sold, her savings diminished, but her conscience somewhat clearer. "Is this seat taken?" Karen looked up to find Mrs. Miller standing before her. She nearly knocked over her coffee in surprise. "No, please," she gestured awkwardly. Mrs. Miller sat, maintaining a careful distance. "I thought that was you. You look different." Karen touched her hair, now styled simply without the elaborate highlights. "Everything's different." They sat in uncomfortable silence before Mrs. Miller spoke again. "Emma started training with her new service dog last week, a black lab named Scout." That's wonderful," Karen said sincerely. "How is she doing?" "Better. The physical therapy is working, though she still uses the wheelchair more than before." Mrs. Miller hesitated. "Your contribution to the GoFundMe made the training possible much sooner than we expected." Karen nodded, uncertain how to respond. She'd donated anonymously, under her maiden name. "How did you know it was me?" she finally asked. "The training center mentioned the donor requested updates on Emma's progress. Not many people would be that invested." Another silence fell between them, less strained than before. "I've been volunteering," Karen said suddenly, "at the animal shelter. Mostly administrative work. Turns out I'm good with paperwork and procedures. But sometimes I help with the dogs too." Mrs. Miller's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's surprising." "I needed to do something meaningful," Karen admitted. "After everything." In the distance, children laughed on the playground. Karen thought about her own daughter, who had refused to speak to her for weeks after the incident made national news. "The thing is," Karen continued, "I spent my whole life believing structure and rules were everything. Control meant safety. But I controlled things so tightly I couldn't see the people behind the violations anymore." Mrs. Miller nodded slowly. "Emma asks about you sometimes." Karen's head snapped up. "She does?" "She's trying to understand. We all are." Mrs. Miller sighed. "What you did was terrible, Karen. But what you did afterward, it mattered. It doesn't balance the scales." "No," Mrs. Miller agreed, "it doesn't. But it shows you're more than your worst moment." As they talked, Karen's phone buzzed with a notification from the animal shelter. A new litter of puppies had arrived, including one with special needs that would require extensive training. "I should go," Karen said, showing Mrs. Miller the message. "They need volunteers for the evening shift." As she stood to leave, Mrs. Miller said, "Emma's physical therapy is at the community center on Thursdays. Scout is still learning, and the trainer suggested exposure to different people would help, if you wanted to stop by." The invitation hung in the air, tentative and fragile. "I'd like that," Karen said quietly, "if Emma would be comfortable with it." "I can't promise she will be," Mrs. Miller answered honestly. "But possibility has to start somewhere." As Karen walked away, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Not the rigid satisfaction of rules enforced or property values maintained, but the humbler hope of amends in progress. It wasn't forgiveness. That might never come fully. But it was a doorway left slightly ajar. Her phone buzzed again with another shelter message. "Puppy with mobility issues needs special harness training." Karen quickened her step. There was work to be done, and this time, it wasn't about control, it was about healing. Both for a puppy who needed help, and for a woman still learning how to be human again. Behind her, the bench where they'd sat remained, unremarkable, ordinary, yet somehow marking the spot where something broken had begun, against all odds, to mend.